Ladies and gentlemen, most of you, of course, are familiar with our first speaker, Phil Rushton. In fact, if you're not, you've got some explaining to do. You should definitely, I in fact order you to go out and buy his book, Race, Evolution, and Behavior. It's really one of the great works ever written about race. And in a sane world, Phil Rushton would be widely honored for his contributions to science, but given the insane world we live in, he's been insulted and reviled, but of course never refuted.
Yeah, well, you know, that's just like your opinion, man.
Who's got the sweetest disposition? One guess who? Who never starts an argument? Who never shows a bit of temperament? Who's never wrong but always right? Who never dream of starting a fight? Who gets stuck with all the bad luck? No one but Donald Duck.
Psychology professor Philippe Rushton unleashed a storm of controversy with his theories on racial differences. In its simplest terms, Rushton asserts that genetics are as important as environment in determining intelligence and personality. He claims that his research proves that whites are genetically superior to blacks and that Orientals are superior to both whites and blacks. TV London is presenting this debate between Rushton and Canadian geneticist David Suzuki because of the intense discussion that the subject has caused nationally. In airing the debate live, however, we do make the disclaimer that the views being offered are those of the participants and not necessarily those of TV London. Now, our reporter Bob Smith is standing by. Bob, what's the situation there now at Alumni Hall?
I don't think I need to tell you what the situation is. You can see and hear what the situation is here in front of Alumni Hall tonight. This protest started well over an hour ago. These are students. Do you have any concerns about trying to do that job?
Hopefully no. People here lined up a long time in order to get a seat. They're all students who are here interested in hearing what Dr. Rushton and Dr. Suzuki have to say. Obviously, there's going to be the odd heckle, but beyond that, I think people are going to be quiet, and I'm hoping people are going to be quiet in order for the debate to take place. If we have an event such that people are making so much noise that it cannot continue, we're going to have to stop the debate until it quiets down, and that's the only choice we have.
Do you have any concerns about anybody crashing the event? People who don't have tickets, perhaps some of the white supremacists you mentioned a moment ago?
No, we've got fairly tight security at the front, and I'm not too worried about that. The groups that I do know that are demonstrating are boycotting the event. They've said that it shouldn't be going on, and because of that, they're not going to be coming inside. They have no interest in coming inside. I really don't have much worries about that.
At the moment, my watch says about 8:12, 8:13. What's the best guess as to when this event might begin?
I think we should be starting in the next 3 or 4 minutes.
Okay. What will the format be tonight?
The format will be, first of all, Dr. Rushton will be speaking for 20 minutes, and Dr. Suzuki will speak for 20 minutes, and then they'll both have a rebuttal period of 10 minutes each. And after that, after Dr. Suzuki gives his rebuttal, then we'll move to question period, where members of the audience can ask questions at any of the 4 floor mics here.
All right.
I'm not sure what that applause was for.
No, I'm not sure what that applause was for either, but it was rather strong. All right, Al, I think that's it from here. I don't know if you have any questions you'd like to ask at this point, or...
Clarify one thing for me, Bob.
Yeah.
The delay there tonight, is it simply a case where the crowd is so large it's taken them a while to get in the gates, to get in and get their seats?
Yeah, maybe you could answer that, Michael. Is the delay because the crowd was so large that it couldn't get itself into the building in time?
Essentially, yes. Because of the security was so tight, we could only let people in at a slow rate. We didn't expect it to take this long. When we saw the length of the line, we even opened the doors 10 minutes earlier than we'd planned originally, and the delay is because people weren't inside. But it appears that everybody is inside now, and I think we'll probably get started in a few minutes.
In terms of security, I know that some time was spent trying to develop a security plan here, even though there was only a short period of time to do that. The things seem to be coming off the way you'd hope they would in terms of the number of security people and their positions in the building.
So far, so good. We'll just have to see what happens, I guess.
Okay, thank you, Michael. All right, on your way.
Michael.
So okay, Al, I guess we're in a holding pattern here is the way it works. As far as I know, the 2 debaters are in the building and are ready to go. But we're still standing by,
Bob,
waiting to hear whether or not we're going to get this thing underway in the next minute or two.
Do we know if Mr. Rushton and Mr. Suzuki have met?
I don't know that. In fact, I don't believe they have met, only through each other's work, if you will. But I don't believe they've met in person. They may have met backstage at this point, but certainly they hadn't met prior to this evening.
Well, my understanding is that David Suzuki flew into London just a little over an hour ago.
Yeah, he was a last-minute thing, really. He would have preferred not to have been the person doing this debate tonight. He supplied the Students' Council with a list of several other names of people he thought might be better people to do the debate, more knowledgeable in the field. But for one reason or another, they couldn't make it, and so he felt that somebody had to do this debate, so he came in tonight, and he's ready to take him on. And if it feels something like a prize fight here, well, maybe it is. There are a couple of heavyweights, and I think everybody's waiting for this thing to get underway.
Can you get any kind of a feeling there of how many people are actually from the university and how many will be off campus?
Oh, let me take a quick scan around the building. Certainly, it's predominantly university students, and again, most of them are from the University of Western Ontario. There are a few faces here of people who have picked up tickets from outside the university, of members of the community.
They must be getting awfully close to beginning. We just saw a quick shot there of David Suzuki. Appeared he was looking out on stage. One thing for Philippe Rushton, this could be a warm-up of sorts for him. There's this story today that he has been invited south of the border to appear with Geraldo Rivera.
Yeah, we're promising, or I don't think they're promising, but I think there's a pretty good indication. No chairs will be thrown tonight. I don't think Professor Rushton's going to suffer a broken nose. But we certainly have an awful lot of media here. There are 2,000 seats sold in Alumni Hall, and then they put aside another 300 for all the various reporters from across this country. There are national networks here. There's newspapers, magazines, radio stations. So they're all anxiously waiting. There are others who are still taking their seats, as a matter of fact, at the moment.
As we understand it, too, the debate, once they do get it started, and they're running about 15 minutes late at this point, once they get it started, there is what, 20 minutes for Dr. Suzuki and 20 minutes for Dr. Rushton?
Dr. Rushton, and then there's a rebuttal period of 10 minutes each way. And then once that's completed, then they'll basically open up the floor to questions. And I think most people are really looking forward to that, to see what kind of mood this crowd's in. Obviously, Professor Rushton won't have too many supporters in the audience, and he's fully aware of that. But it'll be interesting just to see how angry this crowd is. Certainly, the people out in front of this building are not making any secret of their feelings on it or their emotions. Very emotional issue. But I think we'll find out when that question and answer period begins just what kind of crowd we do have here and just how hard they'll go at Professor Rushton.
Just to go back over a couple of the events earlier in the day, the Ontario Federation of Students said it was outraged at Philippe Rushton's theories. Their chairperson, Shella Potter, cautioning that didn't mean that Rushton should be prevented from teaching them. She said many disproven theories had been debated in the classroom. And another development, the University of Western Ontario Senate decided to call a special meeting on racism and academic freedom in the wake of the Rushton controversy. Substantial turnout expected for a motion deploring racism and another on the responsibilities involved in academic freedom. Let's go back down now to Bob Smith and the participants taking the stage at Alumni Hall.
Okay, thank you very much, Al. I won't say anything more. The event is about to begin. I'll step aside.
Good evening. My name is Chris Gibbs, and I'm the International Student Commissioner. On behalf of the International Student Federation and the University Student Council, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's debate. Speaking first in support of his paper, Evolutionary Biology and Heritable Traits, is a professor at Western. He's first educated at the University of London, where he received a Bachelor of Science in 1970 and a PhD in 1973. He went on to do postdoctoral work at Oxford and has since written 5 books and over 100 articles on the evolutionary component of developmental, personality, and social psychology. This year, he is a fellow of the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation and is currently writing a 6th book on genetics and personality. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Philippe Rushton. Speaking in opposition to the report is a Canadian geneticist who, it is said, has done more for the public awareness of science in Canada than any other. He was educated at the University of Amherst in Chicago, where he received a PhD in 1961. He went on to receive the Siassi Memorial Fellowship for Best Young Canadian Scientist in 1969. He has also received the Royal Bank Award and in 1986 the UNESCO Kalinga Prize for Science Writing. Most recently, he has co-written the most widely used textbook in North America, An Introduction to Genetic Analysis. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. David Suzuki. Timekeeping for us tonight is James Sabrola of King's Debating Union. And our moderator from University Student Council Speakers Commissioner and President of the Western Debating Union, Mike Brown. I'll turn you over to him now.
Again, on behalf of the Students' Council, thank you for coming out tonight. The format for the debate this evening shall be as follows. First, Dr. Rushton will give his opening remarks. He'll have 20 minutes in which to do this. Then Dr. Suzuki will speak for 20 minutes. Then each debater will have a 10-minute rebuttal period. First Dr. Rushton and then Dr. Suzuki. After this period, that will be the end of the debate, and we will open the floor for questions at one of the 4 floor microphones. Before we start, I would like to ask something of the audience. I realize that a lot of you have very strong feelings about things that are going to be said tonight. I would ask you if you could please remain quiet while the debaters are speaking, especially for the sake of the other people in the audience and for the sake of the people up here. Without any further ado, I would like now to call upon Professor Philippe Rushton to deliver his opening remarks, reminding him that he has 20 minutes in which to do so.
In many ways, it would have been much better if Mother Nature had made people genetically all the same. Cooperation would be easier, and we could design just one type of society that would fit everybody. However, we are not all the same. Even children within the same family differ from each other genetically. If we examine how wide the differences are, even between brothers and sisters who share the same food, watch the same TV, go to the same schools, and have the same parents, how much more different from each other must we expect the human races to be? I did not always believe that this was the case. 10 years ago, I would have said that any differences which existed would almost certainly have been primarily environmental in origin. However, I have been persuaded by data and findings from numerous sources that the races do differ genetically in the mechanisms underlying their behavior. In this talk, I would like to share some of this information with you. There are 3 quite separate questions that have to be kept in mind. First, what exactly are the differences between the races? Second, are the differences due partly to genetic factors? Third, how could genetically based differences between the races have arisen through evolution? First then, let us overview the findings on racial differences in behavior. I have observed that the order in which the races currently score on tests of intelligence, or on measures of educational achievement, or on measures of occupational achievement, that is, Orientals higher than Caucasians and Caucasians higher than blacks, is matched by the same rank order on over 60 other psychological, behavioral, and physiological measures, as well as on estimates of genetic similarity. Let us begin at the beginning, at the moment of conception. The average woman produces one egg every 28 days in the middle of the menstrual cycle. Some women, however, produce 2 eggs in a cycle, an event which often results in the production of twins. The races differ in the rate at which they produce such eggs. Among Orientals, the frequency of twins in every 1,000 births is less than 4. Among Caucasians, the rate is 8 per 1,000. And among blacks, the figure is more than 16 per 1,000, with some African populations having twin frequencies of 57 per 1,000. Note that Caucasians fall between Oriental and black populations, and that these figures are to be found from very many different countries. The possible significance of the racial differences in egg production I will return to later. The speed with which the races mature physically is also a source of differentiation, with black children being relatively fast maturers and Oriental children slow maturers relative to Caucasian children. In the United States, black babies have a shorter gestation period than white babies. By week 39, 51% of black children have been born, while the figure for whites is 33%. Similar results have been obtained in Europe, comparing women of European ancestry with black women from Africa. Motor development over the first 3 years also differentiates the races on many well-standardized tests, with measures made from birth to 12 months in coordination and head lifting, in muscular strength and rolling over, and at 15 to 20 months in the ability to put on clothing. Thus, Oriental children typically don't walk until 13 months, compared to 12 months for white children and 11 months for black children. Other life cycle traits, including longevity, show a similar set of differences between the 3 populations. In personality and temperament, the data show that across ages, across traits, and across methods, that in terms of uninhibited temperament, blacks are more uninhibited than Caucasians, and Caucasians are more uninhibited than Orientals. With infants and young children, observer ratings are the main method employed, whereas with adults, the use of standardized tests are more frequent. For example, a study carried out with 825 4- to 6-year-olds in Quebec preschoolers found that teachers consistently reported better social adjustment and less hostility aggression from Orientals than from Caucasians, and from Caucasians than from black children. With adults, I have recently averaged the results from 25 countries using a well-known personality questionnaire, and found that 8 Oriental samples, with a sample size of over 4,000, were less sociable and more anxious than 30 Caucasian samples, with a sample size of 20,000, who were less sociable and more anxious than 4 African samples, with a sample size of 2,000. The same racial pattern of whites being between Orientals and blacks is also to be found with reproductive or sexual restraint. Surveys of the world literature show that Orientals are the most restrained, whether measured by intercourse frequencies, premarital, marital, or extramarital, reproductive speed, age of first intercourse, age of first pregnancy, or number of pregnancies per unit of time, primary sexual characteristics, secondary sexual characteristics, or biologic control of behavior. Concomitant differences are observed in sexual attitudes and in sexually transmitted diseases, including AIDS. In addition, social organization can be studied. Stable social organization depends on following rules. This can be indexed by marital functioning, mental durability, and law-abidingness. With respect to crime, for example, in both the United States and Western Europe, race is one of the best predictors, and quite possibly in other parts of the world too. For Chinese and Japanese, whether assessed in their home countries, North America, or the United Kingdom, have a lower incidence of crime than do Europeans. African-descended people, while consisting of less than 1/8 of the population of the United States or of London, England, currently account for over 50% of the crime in both places. Since about the same proportion of victims say that their assailant was black, the arrest statistics cannot be blamed entirely on police prejudice. This morning I read estimates in the Globe and Mail that confirm that these figures appear to apply to Canada, or at least Toronto. Blacks currently appear to make up between 2 and 5% of Toronto's population, and they also appear to be responsible for between 32 and 40% of Toronto crime. Finally, we turn again to the issue of intelligence test scores. Since the time of World War I, when widespread testing began, blacks have scored about 15 IQ points lower than whites on tests of intelligence and educational achievement, whether tested in the United States, the United Kingdom, Jamaica, Nigeria, Tanzania, or Uganda. Fewer people are aware, however, that Orientals score about 5 points higher than do whites on exactly the same measuring instruments, whether tested in Canada, the United States, Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Malaysia, Singapore, or other countries. It may also come as a surprise to learn that the same order is observed with measures of brain size, whether indexed by cranial capacity from inside the skull or brain weight as measured at autopsy. I have averaged numerous estimates, some quite recent, finding for cranial capacity, Orientals 1,448 cubic centimeters, whites 1,408 cubic centimeters, and blacks 1,334 cubic centimeters. For brain weight, Orientals 1,351 grams, whites 1,336 grams, and blacks 1,286 grams. It is noteworthy that even the most critical of reviewers, such as Stephen Jay Gould, from his own estimates, I have observed exactly the same rank ordering, finding a 1 cubic inch of difference between each of the 3 races. If you have a look at page 66 of his book, The Mismeasure of Man, you can calculate the figures for yourself. Moreover, while brain weight begins to decrease around age 25 in European samples, the decrease may not begin until the mid-30s in Japanese samples. That, very briefly, is the evidence on racial differences. To summarize, on over 60 different measures, including brain size and intelligence, on speed of physical maturation, on personality and temperament, and on sexuality and social organization, Caucasians fall consistently between Oriental and black populations. The second question to be addressed is, what are the causes of these differences? Most people will argue that the racial differences that I have listed are due entirely to environmental factors, to the effects of poverty, socioeconomic status, to biases in the tests and in biases in society. I do not deny that these factors are operative. Indeed, I suggest that they may account for as much as 50% of the variance. What I am arguing, however, is that the other 50% is due to genetic and evolutionary mechanisms. Many large-scale studies of twins and of adoptees have now been carried out, showing the importance of genetic factors on almost all the variables that I have mentioned, including temperament, strength of the sex drive, health, longevity, as well as crime, intelligence, and educational achievement. But you can ask, can these figures, calculated mostly on white populations, be generalized to other races? I believe they can, and I am publishing papers to that effect in scientific journals. The argument is somewhat technical, but in essence, it is that the racial group differences which exist are most noticeable on those subtests which are the most genetically influenced. For example, there is a positive correlation between a subtest's heritability and the degree to which it differentiates the races. And that is a differential prediction. A positive correlation is expected only if racial group differences are due to the genes. If the differences had been due entirely to the environment, the correlation should have been a negative one. Much data from other researchers can also be interpreted in support of my argument. For example, a 17-year adoption study of black children adopted into white middle-class families has shown that the black children's IQ and educational achievement, and also their social deviance, is better predicted by their genetic background than by their upbringing environment. Now, the ultimate aim of science is causally to explain the world around us rather than simply to describe it. Most explanations of the data I have reviewed tend to be highly particularistic, that is, very specific to a particular domain. For example, black scores on IQ tests are attributed to bias inherent in the tests. Black crime is attributed to poverty. Poor performance in schools is blamed on prejudice by teachers, and so on. None of those explanations, by the way, will explain the higher than Caucasian performance by Orientals. Orientals, for example, had lower crime rates than whites, even when they were lower than whites in socioeconomic status. The crux of my argument, and I'd really like to emphasize here that this is the essential point, is that whatever theory you come up with to explain the differences, that theory really has to explain the totality of the findings. It has to explain why there is a pattern 1, 2, 3, with Caucasians falling consistently between Oriental and black populations on variables such as the production of twins and brain size, and even variables such as the depth of the voice, on which Caucasians again fall between the other two races. So it's not just IQ and crime or educational performance. It's much more deeply embedded in evolution than that. One theory, which I believe goes quite a long way in making sense of the racial group differences, stems out of the literature on animal evolution. This is the theory of R and K reproductive strategies. Essentially, an animal can replicate its genes, which is what evolution is all about, in one of two extreme ways. Either be an R, like oysters, and produce hundreds of thousands of offspring, but give no parental care, and expect almost all of them to die. Or be K, and produce only one infant every 4 or 5 or 6 years, but lavish enormous parental care on them. These two different strategies among animals go along with a wide range of life history traits. The more K an animal group, that is, the fewer eggs it produces, the longer is its period of gestation, the higher the birth weight, the more delayed the onset of physical maturity, the older the age of first reproduction, the longer the life, the larger the brain, and the greater the degree of social organization. Thus, diverse organismic characteristics, not otherwise relatable, are presumed to co-vary along a single dimension. Because the races differ on many of the K characteristics, it is hypothesized that Orientals are more K-selected than Caucasoids, who in turn are more K-selected than Africans. Recall, for example, that Orientals produce the fewest eggs but have the largest brains, while blacks produce the most eggs but have the smallest brains. But why would Orientals have ended up the most K? At this stage of our knowledge, we cannot know for sure. One reasonable hypothesis that fits the data, however, is to be found in recent genetic distance studies based on DNA sequencing. These suggest that modern humans evolved in Africa, perhaps even as recently as 200,000 or so years ago, and subsequently migrated northwards to other parts of the globe, with an African, non-African split occurring about 110,000 years ago, and a Caucasoid Oriental split occurring 41,000 years ago. It seems reasonable to postulate that as populations moved north, they encountered more challenging environments, including the last ice age, which ended only 12,000 years ago. And thus the more stringent were the selection pressures for intelligence, forward planning, and sexual and personal restraint. The Siberian cold experienced by Oriental populations was more severe than even that experienced by other pale-skinned populations in Northern Europe. There are two final points that I'd like to make before concluding. First, in any analysis of the kind presented here, it really must be emphasized that there is enormous variability within each of the populations. Since these distributions clearly overlap, it is always problematic to generalize from a group average to any particular individual. Second, recall my earlier remarks that only 50% of the variance is genetic, and that 50% is due to the environment. Even the genetic effects are necessarily mediated by neuroendocrine and psychosocial mechanisms, thus availing much opportunity for intervention and the alleviation of suffering. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Dr. Rushton for his remarks, and I'd now like to call upon Dr. Suzuki to give his opening remarks, reminding him that he has 20 minutes in which to speak.
I feel very proud of this audience tonight. You've shown that we're in Canada and not South Africa with your politeness. As a London boy, I'm always happy to return to my hometown. Tonight is different. I did not want to be here. I do not believe that we should dignify this man and his ideas in public debate. I am deeply concerned as a broadcaster with the media's frenzy that have provided Rushton a wide audience for ideas that simply do not qualify as science. I am outraged. I am outraged that students on this campus could not find a single professor at Western who would debate this man here. They could find no psychologists, no academics who would counter these monstrous claims. Instead, they were told this is an academic matter, this is not a public matter, or we have to respect academic freedom. Now, it is true, one of the most sacred privileges we have in society is academic freedom. To explore ideas at the very edge of human thought that society or religions or politicians may find threatening or dangerous. We must protect the right of scholars to do this. But there is a reciprocal responsibility. The academic community must uphold a standard of scholarship and research that justifies this privilege. The public or students can't judge the merits of esoteric scientific ideas, and we heard about R's and K's and all this stuff tonight. Yet the public is profoundly affected by the ramifications of these ideas. So the academic community has a great role to play to ensure that all ideas, but especially those with enormous social ramifications, can withstand critical scrutiny. Rushtons do not in a fundamental way. And we must ask then, where are those scholars on this campus to say so? Where are those hotshot molecular geneticists whose work he's citing, who gladly go for grants on biotechnology but don't get up when it comes to an important social issue? Where are the psychologists? Where are the psychologists to get up here? I'm not a psychologist. Rushton's right, I'm not a psychologist. I don't read that stuff. I can understand after hearing this why psychology has a bad rep with the rest of science. But in refusing to condemn this work on academic grounds, in allowing him to continue his work and spread his ideas, in providing research funding, in allowing his articles to be published, scientists and scholars legitimate his work and must be condemned for a serious dereliction of responsibility. You see, there will always be Rushtons in the world, and we must always be prepared to root them out and not hide behind academic freedom. I agreed reluctantly, very reluctantly, this is the last thing I need, to debate, because no one, to my knowledge, has confronted the fact that his work has no scientific validity. And that's what I want to spend the rest of my time talking about. Too much of the criticism has been focused on the details of his work. It is true that there are many areas of criticism about the selectivity of data, the validity, whether he has any validity in his reference material, the lack of evidence for heritability of what are highly complex physical and behavioral traits, the meaninglessness of race as a biological term, the confusion of correlation with causation. But to deal with these matters implies that there is a proper, question, that he's a legitimate question to his work, and there isn't. At the very heart of Rushton's analysis is the work that was carried on by one of his mentors, Arthur Jensen, the Berkeley psychologist. It has long been documented, and there is no denial on this, as he said this evening, that the IQ scores of black and white populations fall along different curves. That has not been denied in any way. When plotted on a graph, the familiar bell-shaped curve, standardized to 100 for whites, reveals that when blacks are plotted on the same graph, they plot about 1 standard deviation below. This is not in contention. The question is whether the lower scores of blacks results from the impact of racism or merely reflects genetic difference between the races. Rushton assumes the latter. Well, we know that IQ scores are not fixed by our genes. Numerous studies show that IQ scores of different groups can be changed by the race or sex of an examiner, or the enrichment of education, adoptive families, and so on. And he admits that up to 50% of complex behavioral traits may very well be environmental. So no one's quibbling about that, whether environment plays a role here. Note, I do not equate a score on an IQ test with intelligence. You get a number and that's all we're talking about. Now, the question is, how can we show a genetic component to an IQ score? If there were 2 or 3 genes involved, we would very easily be able to see a standard pattern of Mendelian inheritance. That would very quickly reveal itself, but we don't see that. There may be dozens of genes that affect the way we think and perform on tests. And that means that we can't do an analysis in a traditional way of looking at pedigrees. What we have to apply then are our statistical means. The way we do this is to match pairs of individuals according to their degree of relatedness. Identical twins which have an identical set of genes, raised together, raised apart, fraternal twins raised together, raised apart, first cousins, and so on. Now, first of all, identical twins do not score identically. Okay, so both members of a pair don't score identically on these tests. So that in itself tells you that genes alone are not responsible for the score that you get. Now, I'm willing to go along with the evidence, although you all know of the hoax that was performed by Sir Cyril Burt on identical twin studies, which is a major study for many, many years. Forget that. I have no doubt that the matching of pairs of individuals by degree of relatedness show that on average identical twins have closer scores than do non-identical twins, who have closer scores than do first cousins, and so on. So there is an indication that there is a factor of heredity that affects where one falls along a normal distribution curve. So we would agree that there is a factor of heritability then determining where one falls, but that position on the curve is strongly influenced as well by the environment. But if we look at the bell-shaped curve, the people up at the one end of the curve will be genetically different in some way from people that fall further down towards the center and down towards the bottom. This I'll accept as a reasonable hypothesis. We know then that nature and nurture affects IQ scores, and that it does so in both populations of blacks and whites. Jensen then concludes that since there is a heritable factor affecting IQ scores in blacks, affecting IQ scores in whites, the difference in the mean of the two populations must be determined as well genetically. And that's where he departs from the point of, or the legitimacy of his data. You see, in order to do that, to make that leap and say genes determine distribution along both curves, therefore the mean, the average difference between them is also genetically determined, he has to have two populations that are completely identical in all respects except race. However, as much as we try to match the two populations for social position, income, education, and so on, no amount of care in scientific planning can eliminate the fact that we live in a society in which racism is rampant, and the very fact of being black in North America guarantees a radically different experience and social milieu for any individual, however well educated. Now remember, neither Rushton nor Jensen is a geneticist. After Jensen published his work in 1969, the Genetic Society of America, the leading genetics organization in the world, overwhelmingly approved a GSA statement that such work as Jensen's cannot prove a genetic basis for IQ difference in races. World-class population geneticists, two of the leading population geneticists in the world, Luca Cavalli-Sforza of Stanford and Sir Walter Bodmer of Oxford, and Richard Lewontin of Harvard, have written books on this subject. In October 1970, of Scientific American, Bodmer and Cavalli-Sforza published the definitive popular work entitled Intelligence and Race, in direct response to Jensen's work. Their opening sentence is, and I quote, "To what extent might behavioral differences between social classes and between races be genetically determined?" 11 pages later, and that's a long article in Scientific American, they conclude, and again I quote, "The question of a possible genetic basis for the race IQ difference will be almost impossible to answer satisfactorily before the environmental differences between U.S. blacks and whites have been substantially reduced. There is no good case for encouraging the support of studies of this kind on either theoretical or practical grounds." End of quote. They point out the hazards of suppression of scientific inquiry, harking all the way back to Galileo. But they also remind us that scientists already accept imposed limits, for example, on experimentation in people. We don't say, no, we have to have academic freedom to treat or use new drugs and test them on people or inject viruses into people without complying with certain requirements, or even increasingly on animals. We subscribe to certain rules and regulations on that. Bodmer and Cavalli-Sforza finally conclude, and I quote, "In the present racial climate of the U.S., studies on racial differences in IQ, however well-intentioned, could easily be misinterpreted as a form of racism and lead to an unnecessary accentuation of racial tensions. Since we believe that, for the present at least, no good case can be made for such studies on either scientific or practical grounds, we do not see any point in encouraging the use of public funds for their support. There are many more useful biological problems for the scientists to attack." This is a very cautious and conservative statement, believe me, and I concur with it. Racial tensions have not been substantially changed over the past 2 decades, yet Rushton is claiming what Bodmer and Cavalli-Sforza clearly show cannot be proved. Why then does he persist? I don't know if he's a racist or what his motives are. I don't know him and I don't care. But one can only infer, on the basis of what geneticists have written, that he is either grossly ignorant or deliberately mischievous. Either way, what has to be done is action by scientists and academics. His claims must be denounced, his methodology discredited, his grant revoked, and his position terminated at this university. This is not science. This study is not just a question of basic research. The implications for society are immense. I believe that academics must be free to explore ideas that may conflict with existing social values and assumptions, but one must do so with a profound sense of responsibility and a constant scrutiny to ensure that minimum academic standards are adhered to. Rushton's work fails on all counts, and you at the University of Washington are besmirched by it.
I'd like to thank Dr. Suzuki for his remarks. We now enter the rebuttal portion of the debate. Speaking first for 10 minutes will be Dr. Rushton.
Well, I'd like to say that I'm very disappointed in Dr. Suzuki's... I'm very disappointed in Dr. Suzuki's presentation. Dr. Suzuki says that my ideas on race are too esoteric, and he shows, however, little more than moral outrage. He says that people like me should be rooted out, and if I heard correctly, he actually called for me to be fired. Well, that is not a scientific argument. I don't know, but there's very much of substance in what he said that I can respond to. He went on about Arthur Jensen and IQ and genetics and completely ignored all the work on two-egg twinning and the 60 other variables that I mentioned, including the ranking of the 3 races. Why is it, I have to ask Dr. Suzuki, why is it that Oriental women double ovulate less often than Caucasian women? Why is it that Oriental children take longer to walk than Caucasian children? Why do Oriental students score higher than Caucasians on IQ tests? Why shouldn't people want to study that if they want to? There are a number of ways that members of this audience can test for themselves whether I am right or wrong, whether I am a scientist or not. First, and most easily, they can do a literature search in the library. All you have to do is go to the reference texts, such as Index Medicus, Psychological Abstracts, Science Citation Index, and so on, most of which, by the way, are now computerized, and plug in the key words such as race and sexuality, race and intelligence, race and physical maturation, and then examine the references that emerge. See whether my statements on race are or are not representative of the literature. Have I been selective? Judge for yourselves. Next, you can gather data of your own. While it certainly may be difficult to gather data using IQ tests, it is not difficult to collect informal data on social variables. For example, I have argued that Oriental populations are, on average, less sociable and more cautious than Caucasians and blacks. With a bit of ingenuity, you can probably think up ways to ask questions that measure sociability and cautiousness. For sociability, ask people how many parties they've been to in the last 14 days. Were they large parties? How many friends do they have? For cautiousness, ask people if they always wear a seatbelt. Don't limit yourself to one question. Ask many questions. Get a representative score. If you think that this is absolutely crazy to suggest, do the studies, do it scientifically, learn how to do the methodology, and then show that the rank ordering that I predict will occur, show that it does not occur. That's science. That disproves me. Moral invective that my opponent has shown doesn't add very much to anything. Indeed, even intelligence and brain size can be examined. Take a tape measure. Put it around people's heads. Measure the head circumference. It is a very crude measure indeed. But try, after you've collected that data, relating it to the grades that the students get. Now, I admit you will have to have a large sample, and I admit you may even have to take body size into account. I have done the study twice myself, and I have found a small positive correlation between head size measured externally from around the head and IQ test scores and grades. Laugh if you want to. laugh and make as much ridicule as you like, but the best way to show me that I'm wrong is to do the study and publish it in a scientific journal. Although getting a handle on genetics is much more difficult, there may even be ways to do this. Ask people who have achieved well, let us say university students or their fathers. Now ask whether that target person's next youngest brother did as well. Oh, wait. There is a genetic prediction to be made. The genetic prediction is that Oriental brothers will be more similar in high achievement than, say, Caucasian brothers. That is, there will be less statistical regression to a low population mean. The main point I'm trying to make is that this is a scientifically researchable area that has not been researched for a long time because of political arguments such as the kind that we've heard from Dr. Suzuki, and I'm suggesting that it is perfectly scientifically respectable, and you all, if you want to, can do that kind of study yourselves. Thank you.
I didn't choose to discuss the points he raised because I tried to point out very clearly that Bodmer and Cavalli-Sforza indicate that the genetic relationship or the correlation of the genetic basis that allows comparison between races is simply not possible. And I did not hear you rebut that in any way. And that is the definitive work. Now, Rushton demands that his work be addressed as legitimate science. If this is representative research in psychology, then I think psychologists ought to really tremble about that. First of all, the concept of race has long been discarded as a meaningful biological category. There's more variation genetically within a so-called race than there is between the means of the two groups. In other words, there are very few genes involved in making us racially distinct. Under Oriental, we include not just Japanese, Chinese, Filipinos, Indonesians, but Inuit and Amerindians. Now, Inuit and Amerindians are the most recent derivatives from the Chinese or the Japanese populations, but they kind of mess up Rushton's idea of this progressive relationship. So how does he deal with that? He says, well, they're an anomaly. Boy, with that kind of selectivity, I could prove anything. Are whites a homogeneous group? I've just come back from Brazil, and man, those are white people down there. They're also East Indians who are Aryans, Arabs, as well as all of the Europeans and Americans. Is that some kind of homogeneous group? What the hell does white mean? You could say the same about blacks. We know that blacks in North America have a lot of white genes in there as well. There's been a lot of crossbreeding there. What does it mean to say these races mean something? And the classes that Rushton thinks are somehow biologically meaningful, litter size. Why not just say family size? Is this supposed to mean that we're like animals? I mean, if we go and study the Québécois in Quebec before and after the Quiet Revolution, Jean Chrétien came from a family of over 17. That wasn't unusual. The enormous impact of religion and environment on litter size. I mean, how are we supposed to take this seriously? And what about law breaking and family closeness and sexual behavior? Has he looked at first, second, and third generation immigrants to North America? What is their behavior as they become different people from the original culture in which their parents grew up? And if there is a genetic basis, what do you do about intermarriage? What happens with the offspring there? Is there any kind of dominance? Do they behave more like Orientals than like whites? What happens to white people that go and live in Japan or China? Are they as aggressive and loud and criminal as people over here? My bet is that the behavior of people in intermarriages or interracial crosses depends on the forcefulness of either parent, which one they resemble, and not race. The overwhelming impression of just looking at immigrants is the incredible plasticity of human beings. Indeed, it is our adaptability to new situations that is a major survival attribute of our species, not a rigid genetically programmed fate and behavior. Richard Lewontin of Harvard has pointed out that if you want a genetic basis for complex human behavior by looking at pedigrees, the best case that we have for the inheritance from parents to offspring of a human behavior is which party you vote for in elections and your religious affiliation. Other than that, there isn't a hell of a lot. And yet we're extrapolating to all of these airy-fairy things, like human behavior and lawlessness and so on. Poverty and discrimination are supposed to somehow be subordinated to this genetic imperative? Come on, let's get serious. In view of the enormous variation within races, within a race, within a category called a race, to use only 3 categories, white, black, and Oriental, and then select very much the data that fit this so-called progression. You know, it's kind of like saying I was in South America and all South Americans walk in line. That is the 2 that I saw do. It doesn't mean very much. Rushton implies that there is a direction or progressive change in evolution, from big penises to smaller ones, from promiscuity to fidelity, from small brains to big brains. There's no such thing. The species' only imperative in evolution is to pass genes on to another generation by whatever means. Thus, the degeneration of the eyes in a blind cave newt is just as progressive as the increase in brain size of a mammal. There's no progression. Evolution uses whatever happens to be there. Finally, Rushton makes a very, very common error, one that I'm afraid will be made increasingly by his brothers, the molecular biologists. And that is, he has collected, and many argue that he has highly selected his data to conform to an idea. He claims to show a collection of traits that correlate with the evolutionary appearance of races. But going from correlation to causal relationship is totally unwarranted. It's as if you studied people with lung cancer and discovered that 80% of people with lung cancer have stained fingers and teeth, and then conclude that stained fingers and teeth cause cancer. Well, I could go on. The word over these data, they simply are not worth dwelling on because they seem to give legitimacy to what he's claiming. Your response to some of the stuff he was saying is, I think is indicative of that we must look at this and simply say this isn't science. For God's sake, if you're serious about this, do all of the proper controls, do all of the other analyses about interracial marriage, about successive generations growing up in different countries, before you even dare to make such outrageous statements. Thank you.
I'd like to thank both the speakers. We now come to the question period portion of this evening. We have approximately 45 minutes left. We will be taking questions sequentially from mics 1 through 4. If you please form a line behind a microphone if you're interested in asking a question. You may direct your question either to Dr. Rushton, to Dr. Suzuki, or to both. We'll begin with a question from microphone number 1.
Dr. Rushton, I'm a student of neither psychology nor of genetics, but I am a student of science. And the first thing they teach you in the 9th grade is that when you're conducting an experiment, the most important factor is the control of variables. Now, in your research, the point where you get to make the strongest case for the isolation of genetics, aside from socioeconomic condition, is the adoption of black children into white families. But nowhere in your paper have I seen any data which shows the effects of adoption on white children in white middle-class families. There are a lot of emotional and sociological problems that exist with adopted children. Where did those factors come into play in your decision?
There are hundreds of adoption studies. I'm sorry I only mentioned one. And most of those adoption studies, in fact, have been carried out on white children. Some of the ones are coming out of Scandinavia, literally have thousands of children who are adopted. And the findings are, it doesn't matter whether you look at longevity, for example, which just came out in the New England Journal of Medicine, obesity, for example, also came out in the New England Journal of Medicine. What they show on thousands of children is that the best predictor of whether you are obese or not and whether you die early, for example, before the age of 55, is the biological parent that you had who you never saw, or at least after the first 6 months of your life, and absolutely no prediction occurs from knowledge of the adopting
I don't mean to interrupt, but how did white children adopted into white middle-class families specifically score on IQ tests and other tests of intelligence and temperament?
Exactly the same thing as for longevity and for obesity. With IQ test scores and for educational achievement, it is compatible with a high heritability. Biological parents are the best predictors of how children perform, not the parents who bring them up for 17 or 20 years. It's a quite amazing finding. And it's a new finding because the first few studies that came out of those adoption studies looked at children when they were 7 or 10 or 13 years of age. And when those studies were published, it really looked like the upbringing environment was important. Now the longer-term studies have been done when these children are 17, 20, and 25, and what you find is that around puberty, around 13 or 14 years of age, the genotype takes over. And the adopting parent, the parent who raises the child, no longer has an effect on that child, but the biological parent still continues to exert an effect via the genes. So that's just compatible with a high heritability for IQ.
Look, you have to be very, very careful in this kind of discussion. I mean, who the hell would ever argue with what he just said? You know, that's not surprising. He may have been surprised. That's not surprising that genes affect the appearance of various characteristics. But it's one thing to talk about obesity. It's a very different thing to say that you're color-coded somehow to be a criminal when you get older, on average. And damn it all, I've just said over and over, you cannot make that statement because you can't control for the environmental effects of racism. So don't legitimate the discussion by listening to this stuff about the inheritance in adopted families and all that. Let's be careful and focus on what the issue is.
Look. The computer that analyzes that data does not know whether the scores pertain to IQ, obesity, longevity, or anything else. If Dr. Suzuki accepts a 50% heritability, how he cannot accept that some of that would generalize to across races is beyond me.
You simply cannot control for racism is all I'm saying. So that kind of distinction, what is it, if 60% or 80%, you can't do it. And the point is, what difference does it? Who cares? It's not a legitimate scientific question. You cannot prove one way or the other, so why persist? That's the question.
Now, Dr. Suzuki's last stand is, who cares? Well, he certainly seemed like he cared for the first 45 minutes, I can tell you that.
We'll now take a question from microphone number 2.
Okay. I'm a minister. I'm a minister of the United Church in Port Stanley. And I must really say that I must say that Dr. Rushton is, I believe he's crazy in all that he has said. And to begin with, I've written a few things. I'm going to comment a little bit and then ask you a question. I should say that I am glad I got a copy of your so-called research and read through before I came here. It is so offensive and unacademic, and I believe Dr. Suzuki has also said the same thing. It is unacademic and full of inaccuracies that I'm sure that my grade 5 boy could have done better. I haven't finished. I compare you to Zundel and Kistra. Wait, I know why I'm saying that. The reason I compare you to both these men is that they claimed, both of them claimed to have made researches, as you claim to have made, and published or taught the offensive results of their research. If Zundel could be prosecuted, and if Kistra could be barred from teaching such hateful views, why could you not be prosecuted or barred from teaching your derogatory, unfounded, distasteful so-called research? Is this not a clear indication of the two systems that Canada faces now? One for the powerful and one for the not so powerful? Or is it because you are supported and protected by a university president who even encourages you to teach such views? You talk about the prevalence of divorce, numerous illegitimate children, and high incidence of crime among the black population in the United States and elsewhere, as compared with other races. You continue to say that this is based on the inherent traits of the black race. Do you know what ghettoizing people does to the people? Do you know that? I believe if you are a good social...
Sir, could you please get to your question? The microphones are for questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, could I ask my question now?
Yes, you may.
What I'm saying is, I wish you could have studied as part of your research the differences in crime rate, divorce, and others between blacks in the ghettos and those in the middle and upper classes. There sure is a difference there, and you should have taken that into consideration. I am very sure about that. To conclude, I would just say that my son, who is the only black boy, the only non-white in his class, he's 10 years. He asked me just 2 nights ago, "Daddy, does it mean that I am the dumbest person in my class just because of you?" And you know what? He is doing better than a lot of people in his class. Now it is going to have a psychological effect on him just because of your inaccuracies and of your craziness. Thank you.
I guess since there was no question asked there, we'll go to microphone number 3. I'd like to ask everybody, please, that the microphones are there for questions. Please ask questions and questions only, and you can address them to either of the debaters up here. Thank you.
I was going to address my question to Professor Rushton. I was going to originally ask a serious question, but I don't think this debate quite warrants it. So since Professor Rushton is so concerned with correlations between groups, I thought he might answer a question that is at the heart of most Western students. Sir, do blondes really have more fun?
I think...
Will there be an answer, sir, or?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Sir, have any of your studies, or perhaps you might like to undertake a study, since you like to study things such as size of penis, testes, vulva, vagina, clitoris, and ovaries, perhaps you would like to undertake a study of do blondes have more fun? Yes.
I'll put it on my agenda for things to study. Thanks.
I guess we'll go to number 4 now, please. We don't want this to degenerate. Please keep your questions serious if you can.
My question is for Dr. Suzuki, and you were saying that you didn't want to legitimize his stance by being here and by having this publicized to the public. Now, I'm just wondering if you think that everybody believes what they read in the papers, what anybody tells them, or do they make informed decisions on what is around them, and do their parents actually affect what they hear, as in children? And in the case of university students, are we not here to view things from both perspectives? Now, whether he is right or wrong, don't you think we should have information from both sides, being university students, to make informed decisions, rather you stating your opinion up there?
I think the exciting part of university is being exposed to a broad range of ideas, you know, from the kooks on one side to the jerks and crazies on the other. And I probably fall on one end and Rushton's on the other. I don't know. Sure. I didn't want to come here. I told the students that over and over, but they told me that they didn't feel they could respond to him. They didn't have the clout. They weren't professors. They didn't have PhDs. And that they were being hammered by this, that in the press it was saying this and that, and academics were saying this, but no one would come and discuss. Now, quite frankly, I wish it had all blown over at the AAAS meetings in San Francisco. I had the article that he submitted there for weeks. I didn't want to do anything on it. But it was the students asking and no one having the whatever it takes to appear, that finally I felt that it couldn't be ignored because it had already become a public event. Now, the problem one always has, whether it's talking to the Rushtons or the Shockleys or the Jensens or whoever, is that one as a media broadcaster always worries, do you legitimize the person by putting him on? Because by virtue of having him on a program, it seems as if this thing is worth paying attention to. And all of the people who are really on the borderline, you know, especially if you have someone who's a Nobel Prize winner or even a professor at a university, you say, well, gee, this professor said this, you know, that affects people. And so one wonders about that. I think this is just bad science. There's no reason to have a public debate about it because it's not science.
Well, I felt that there wasn't really a debate on the issue because I wanted to hear both sides of the story. Now, I've heard a lot about Dr. Rushton's, and I wanted to hear your viewpoint as a genetic.
I thought I did that talking about the distribution of IQ scores, which is at the very heart of his argument. And what I said is, I urge you again to listen to what I said about Bodmer and Cavalli-Sforza, that you can show heritability of IQ scores, but you can't legitimately compare the difference between them. And that applies from IQ scores to all of these so-called complex behavioral traits. It's as simple as that.
Okay, but you have your views, and he has his views.
Sorry, I say that as a geneticist.
Okay, but I came here to get informed information so I could decide, and I think a lot of the university students are intelligent enough to screen out what is crazy and what is not and be able to decide for ourselves. Like, I didn't feel that this was a debate.
Now take a question from microphone number 1.
Okay, first off, I would like to say that I am offended by the basis of this work, Dr. Rushton, and I know that you requested this evening that we not talk about the ethical issues, but I think as Dr. Suzuki has said, it's impossible to divorce science and ethics. I think that you made a politically bad decision when you made such an announcement in San Francisco, and whether you have any political feelings or motivations, it showed a blatant disregard for those type of people who've been struggling against racism and hatred all their lives because of the environment. Now, I would like to ask you a question that was posed to a class of mine the other day, and it goes to the effect of whether you had any sort of racial bias going into the study and why this sort of study is going on. Now, let's suppose, and for the sake of the audience and my safety, getting back to the seat, this is a purely hypothetical question. Let's suppose that your theory is true. What are you recommending? Are you recommending sweeping policy changes? For instance, for education, are you recommending that we now only admit Orientals and some whites who are above average and no blacks, or maybe the opposite? Or can you tell me what are you recommending for immigration policies, for fighting crime, etc.?
For the last 7 or 8 years, my research has been into trying to apply evolution to genetic differences between people. About 20% of that research is concerned with race differences. The other 80% is concerned with sex differences and social class differences and just individual differences, all of which are also contentious issues. I have no policy recommendations to make. I do believe that there are all kinds of political and philosophical and ethical and economic and educational implications of accepting the view that there is an enormous amount of genetic and biological diversity, far more genetic and biological diversity in the human population than we've ever considered before, in my opinion. And that does and will have probably policy implications. But you have to go and ask economists and educators and ethicists and politicians what to do about it, because I don't have any recommendations. I'm just simply, if I have any recommendation at all, it is to the effect that we really must, it's about time, after 120 years since Charles Darwin, it's about time that we human beings accepted that we are another form of animal life on this planet, and that there will be a lot of genetic variance within us, which is the first fundamental postulate of Darwinian theory, is that there's genetic variance. The second postulate is that some of that variance is more successful at getting itself replicated than other parts of the variance. That's evolution. So Darwin's theory at that level is quite easy to understand conceptually. And what I'm saying is that when you look at humans, you've just got to come to terms with the view that there is enormous biological diversity, and we just have to accept that. That's
okay. But can I
the
interrupt
message.
For a second? I think Dr. Suzuki pointed out one big thing, that there was a larger variance within each race than between the races itself, and I think that's the biggest point that had to be made.
And that may or may not be true depending upon which measures you take. And I don't think that's a...
I think that should be obvious.
I don't think that is a settled
when you
matter at
calculate
all.
means, you should be able to come up with variances pretty simply.
Well, variance depends on what measures you're measuring. I mean, if you're taking regulator genes, or whether you're taking nuclear genes or whatever, you get different amounts of variance. If you take IQ test scores, or whether you take on one test, or IQ test scores on a different test, you'll get different amounts of variance. That's not... But look, I take the point without any question, and let me reiterate it, that there is enormous variation within each of the three major racial groups, and along with all other subgroups within those major groups. And I don't think you can generalize from one group to another, from one group to an average individual. I would like to say that I am not a racist. I believe that a racist is a person who will treat all members of a group the same, and usually also to try to deprive them of their civil liberties in some way. I'm not advocating and do not believe in anything of that nature, so I think I've answered the question.
We'll now take a question from microphone number 2.
Professor Rushton, you've said that you're not a racist, but quite frankly, I think you are one hiding under academic freedom. The Globe and Mail printed Saturday, February 4th, quoted you, and I read, "Let's face it, that's what blacks do, ask for special treatment. We've had to change everything in educational system and professional schools to make sure blacks did not fail in large numbers. But if we accept the alternative arguments that blacks aren't as intelligent, then what we have done is lower the standards to allow more in." I mean, quite frankly, I'm very offended by that statement. I mean, in school, most of my friends here and a lot that we know achieve higher than others around us. And I'd like you to answer to what standards have been lowered for us blacks to be here.
Boy, thank you very much for asking that question. I am very happy. Let me just put that into context and I'll answer specifically. That is from the Globe and Mail. It was written by a man called Stephen Strauss, who is the science reporter for the Globe and Mail. He is a man that I've read and admired, and I think he's a good science reporter. And that was a scurrilous piece of work that he published, because what he did was to interview me for about an hour and a half or 2 hours in San Francisco before, in fact, I presented the paper. He interviewed me for about an hour and a half on the telephone here in London, and another 20 minutes subsequently. I gave him as much time as I did because he was a Globe and Mail, because I respected him and so on. And in fact, the first paper he published on me was written about 5 days before that. And then, for reasons I have no idea, I phoned him at his home, the only person I've ever complained to about it. I phoned him up and complained about that, because what he did in that article was, in fact, to take sections out of a paper, sections out of a discussion we had in San Francisco, and put it next to a discussion we had on something else an hour later, and then put it next to something that we had about 3 weeks later, as though I'd strung those 3 or 4 pieces together. And so that was just one example of, okay, now, the context of that particular quotation, which is, "Let's face it, that's what blacks do, isn't it?" is this, that I said, look, if I came to you, if I was a black man and I came to you and I said, look at these statistics, look at breakups of marriages, look at black crime rates, look at black suicide, look at black alcoholism and drug abuse and so on, look at poor educational attainment, look at school dropouts. And black people do this, and they say, look at this, this is proof of a racist society that we are living in. And indeed, this is good evidence that we've got to do something about it. In fact, the Supreme Court of the United States has more or less used that kind of evidence, what they call adverse effect, I believe it's called, as evidence for either affirmative action programs or alleviation of suffering, Head Start programs, and a whole range of social programs. So my point to Strauss was that, of course, that's what blacks do. They use these statistics and interpret them one way, quite reasonably. I'm taking exactly the same statistics, adding in a lot of other variables, but interpreting it to genetic and evolutionary mechanisms, and that is what people are finding completely unacceptable. So I stand by the argument. I do not remotely stand by the context in which that scurrilous piece of work appeared.
Well, primarily this is a Globe and Mail and this is in Canada, and I would still, you have not answered these are all your words, even though they may have been taken out of context. The fact is that you still said them, and what I'm trying to ask is, in what ways have standards been lowered to, especially in Canada, because we're here right now, so that blacks can get into our schools and professional systems?
My stand has been consistently not to comment on policies. You can come up to me and say, what do you think about South Africa? What do you think about immigration? What do you think about the school system? What do you think should be done about crime? What do you think about person X or person Y or current event Z? And I just say, look, I'm not in the business of making recommendations, policies. I don't endorse, I don't condemn. I'm here simply, believe it or not, to try to explain what I think is a very interesting pattern of data. And that's so I can't comment.
You're saying you don't comment on policy whatsoever, but what I've just read are your own words. And I mean, you know, so if you don't comment on policies, then you shouldn't be making comments such as what you've made. And, you know, secondly, okay, I listened to you in a talk show a couple weeks ago, and considering the paper that you've written, and you're going around saying you're not a racist, you had several opportunities in which you could have set people straight. For instance, a lady called in saying how she agreed with you, and then making reference, oh, well, after all, we wouldn't have dogs and cat. Our dogs and cat do not intermix, so why should humans? I mean, you not being a racist could at least, without making a policy statement, could go, well, at least, you know, different kind of dogs do interbreed if you want to go that far. But you said nothing. And for you to go around saying you're not a racist, I think you have to draw the line and clear people up rather than let them go around with racist comments.
We'll now go to a question at microphone number 3.
Yes, I have a statement and then a question for Dr. Suzuki. First of all, concerning, I read your paper, and you're saying that you predict basically that the Pacific Rim is going to be the dominant economic force due to genetics. Now, it's obvious that you never heard about the Trilateral Commission, which was set up in the United States, which demanded that the economic power base would be taken from the United States and be spread out to 3 points in the world. That is the Asian continent on the Pacific Rim, the Central European Economic Community, and the United States. You also forgot about what happened about 30 years ago when Perry visited Japan and the Orient. They were a close society, and when they entered the first scientific displays in England, they had objects made out of paper and wood. And I really would like to see what they would have said about them back then as a race, whether or not they were dominantly intelligent over whites and blacks. And also, let me just say that when you put a race when you say that a race is going to be the dominant economic force in the world, that statement was made about 50 years ago about the Jews being the dominant economic force, and we all know what happened to them as a race. Okay, and now I have a question for Dr. Suzuki that has nothing to do with psychology. It has to do with research that is going on right now about supercomputers are going to be looking at the entire DNA structure of the human being. They figure that in about 5 years they'll be able to take out the map of the DNA structure. Do you think that when this research finally comes through, that geneticists will be able to take a look at the races and finally disprove psychologists with their very weak arguments and with pure science that involves good research and variables and computers?
See, it's very interesting to see that the whole concept of biological determinism, that is that we essentially are an expression of our genetic makeup, which was very heavily discredited after the Nazi so-called experiments in the Holocaust. We went through a period of about 20 years when it was really not popular to say that there is a genetic basis for anything, that basically it was environment that shaped everything. Now, what happened was that with the discovery of DNA, there was a swing back, and it made sense to swing back to genes. I mean, we're obviously an expression of both our genetic makeup and the environment. And now, with the molecular biology, there is a strong swing towards, back towards biological determinism. An assumption that because we have such enormous power to take DNA and manipulate it in the test tube, that we somehow have our hands on the levers of life. And indeed, if you read the papers today that molecular geneticists are writing, you see the same intoxication and exuberance about their discoveries today as people were making early in the century when genetics began. They were saying, we really have it now to be able to predict and control cancer and disease, and we'll be able to improve human beings and so on. And I think there's a tremendous danger here, not of proving or disproving this kind of stuff, but a belief that since we have a standard map of the human genome, all 3 billion bits of information in it, that we now have a standard reference against which we can begin to compare things. So sure, we'll look at heart disease, cancer, various diseases, but then very quickly we'll begin to say, well, what about homosexuals? What about criminals? What about people on welfare? What about the races? And we're going to find differences. I don't have any doubt that we'll find differences in sequences of DNA.
The problem is that people will then make that mistake that Rushton has made. Because you can show a correlation, there is a conclusion that there is a causal relationship. And that is, to me, a great hazard. That we will be able to say that blacks differ from whites, from Orientals in these statistically in these ways. But so what? It's like saying blacks have black skin and whites have whiter skin and Orientals have yellower skin. So what? Doesn't mean anything. You can't jump from that quickly to very complex traits like how many children you have, or how shy you are, or whether you really like to get laid a lot. I mean, all of these things.
Thank you very much.
A response or not?
We'll now take a question from microphone number 4.
Okay, I have a quick statement to make about the university grants as far as research funds and stuff like that. It's my understanding that research in Canada is based on quantity as opposed to quality. And I think that this is a clear indication of that right here. Research funds are given to people who produce quantity as opposed to quality, and that's very dangerous. I have a question for Mr. Rushton. Can you explain to me why someone like Einstein, with an IQ of 129, can have such an impact on our world? With your IQ test, he scores 129. That's a low score. IQ tests only measure surface intelligence. They don't really get into the depth of intelligence. Could you tell me, please, your definition of what intelligence is and how an IQ test measures that?
Did you say Einstein with an IQ of 129, by the way?
Yes, I believe he did.
Okay. Well, 129 is 2 standard deviations above the mean. That's only 2% of the population. That's not a low IQ by any means at all.
Oh, I'm not saying that it's low, but it's certainly not above average. He didn't make Mensa.
Well, in any case, what is intelligence and how do IQ tests measure it and so on? Well, I mean, this is a long and involved question, and those of you who are taking Psych 20, I noticed that you'll be taking the intelligence chapter in the introductory psychology textbook in about 2 weeks. For
the layman, please tell me what intelligence is.
My own view is that probably intelligence ultimately is something that springs from the efficiency or speed with which the brain can process information, as well as the sheer amount of information that it can store and process. So ultimately, I would put it down to some kind of physiological brain-based effect. But of course, we can only measure that, as we can only measure anything, imperfectly. But I should say that this misconception about how bad IQ tests are really is a misconception. They are far from perfect, but they're pretty good predictors, and they're pretty good predictors for black people just as they are for white people. So that black people who score with IQs of 129 like Einstein are going to do very well in university, thank you very much indeed. Even within the same family, there are studies coming now out of, say, places like Detroit, where you can go into a black family and you will see a fair amount of variability among the children, so that some children may have an IQ as low as, let's say, 70. Another child may have an IQ of 85, and another child may have an IQ of, say, 105. Now, the child with an IQ of 105 does very well in the school system. The child with an IQ of 85 has some troubles and may even have some brushes with the law. But the child with an IQ of 70 in that same family probably does not do well at school at all and has a lot of trouble with the law. So these things are not unpredictive.
We have time for about 2 more questions. We'll go to a question from microphone number 1.
Hello, I'm from Canadian University Press, and I have a question for Dr. Rushton. It's a two-part question, actually, and it addresses the Pioneer Fund. How did you get involved with the Pioneer Fund? How much fund?
Could you repeat that? I didn't hear you.
Okay, the Pioneer Fund. How did you get involved with the Pioneer Fund? How much funding did you get, and for how long?
Well, I'm certainly not going to tell you how much money I've received from them, but I can tell you that the Pioneer Fund has come under a lot of scurrilous attack. They're racist, according to a lot of people, because they have funded Arthur Jensen. And Arthur Jensen, by definition to a lot of people, is a racist. Therefore, purely circular way, the Pioneer Fund's racist, and I must be a racist for taking money from them. It works the other way around too. Now that I'm judged to be a racist, the Pioneer Fund's judged to be a racist. And so it goes. The Pioneer Fund was set up, I believe, originally it was actually set up in 1937. It started funding in 1961. It does not have a political agenda. It's not allowed to have a political agenda. It only funds, or primarily funds, people in universities. I know a lot of excellent first-rate scientists that I'm extremely happy to be associated with who receive money from them. And if they're not too embarrassed by all of this that's happened, I will continue to accept money from them.
How long have you been receiving funding from them?
About 4 or 5 years.
And you won't give the amount?
Sorry?
You won't give the amount?
I won't tell you the amount, no.
Okay, thank you.
It's not all that much, I can tell you that.
Take a question, please, from number 2.
Yes, I have a copy here of the Ontario Policy on Race Relations. And this is directed to Phil, by the way. And Clause 3 says, the government will also continue to attack the overt manifestations of racism, and to this end declares that A, racism in any form is not tolerated in Ontario, and B, all doctrines and practices of racial superiority are scientifically false, morally reprehensible, and socially destructive, are contrary to the policies of this government, and are unacceptable in Ontario. Now, you are being shrouded under the umbrella of academic freedom. Will you explain how academic freedom and this policy of our government coincides?
No.
I'm sorry. Speak.
The word racism has 2,000 or 3,000 different meanings. I don't know even what the word means. To me, I've already defined it, that it means the desire to take away somebody's civil liberties, or to treat people in a particular category as all the same, and so on. I can tell you one thing in what you said at the very beginning about superiority and inferiority.
Well, maybe you should get a copy of the policy.
Okay, but I don't use words like superior and inferior. It's obviously... I really don't. It's obviously true that some of the traits that I'm looking at, like, for example, intelligence, people certainly have strong values about, and it's superior to have a higher IQ. But there are other traits, like, for example, sociability, which some people might argue it's better to be more sociable and not to be too introspective. From an evolutionary point of view, superiority ultimately, and I'm sure Dr. Suzuki would agree, is only in terms of genetic fitness, and in terms of humans, we can't tell who 10,000 or 100,000 years from now, whose genes will and whose genes will not be on the face of this earth. That, from an evolutionary point of view, is, I suppose, something like superiority. This has got nothing to do with racism.
My question was, how does this policy coincide with academic freedom?
I don't see any conflict, so I can't explain.
You don't see any conflict?
No. Sorry.
I think you need a brain implant.
That was the last question to be asked, and I just wanted to make a little comment here that I feel, having gone through the exercise, I feel a great deal of pain as an academic myself. Because to think that in 1989, an academic can claim that he's just searching for truth, and that the responsibility for what is done with that truth is society's. I mean, we've heard this for a long time, and since physicists saw the result of theoretical physics in nuclear bombs, since we've seen chemical and biological warfare, scientists have realized, many of them, that you simply can't deal or act as if you're dealing with research in a vacuum. You're getting public funding to do this work, and the implications are enormous. And the idea that I'm just searching for truth and what you do with that in a society in which racism is rampant. I'm not saying he's a racist, I don't know. But in a society in which racism is rampant, to suggest that it's my right as an academic to simply give you the truth is something we ought to think about. And I think every academic here, I challenge you. You see the pain coming out in these questions. These are not trivial conclusions he's coming to. These are not trivial suggestions. They impinge on people's lives and they affect them and their children. And I call on academics to stand up.
Again, on behalf of this, I'm sorry, sir. I'm sorry, sir. On behalf of the University Students' Council, I'd like to thank everybody for coming out tonight.
Says they own the world in space. The higher, right in her Goebbels' face. Then her Goring says they'll never bomb this place. The higher, right in her Goring's face. Is we not the Superman? Arian Pura Superman? Yeah, we is the Superman. Super duper Superman. Eure Hitler's golden order. Everyone a foreign race will love the poorest face when we bring to the world disorder. Then the poorest says he is the master race. Be higher, right in the poorest face. Heraus, mein Hund! The poor says we never will be slaves. The Heil, but still we work like slaves, while the poor brags and lies and rants and raves. The Heil, and work into our graves. Heil Hitler! Get to work!
Michelle and I dropped off our daughters for the first day of school today. They were just thrumming with excitement, just beside themselves, wanting to go to school. And the reason is because they've got a school with well-trained, well-paid, enthusiastic teachers with wonderful facilities. They've got a couple of parents who, from an early age, taught them that learning was fun. As much as I love my children and know that they are the best children on earth, I also understand that that joy in learning that I see in them should be true for every child. And there's no reason why any American child on their first day of school shouldn't have that same excitement and that same opportunity. You know, no one needs to tell me about the importance of education, because I wouldn't be where I am today without it. I didn't come from wealth, I didn't come from power. My family came from relatively modest means, but they had a good education and they instilled in me a desire for a good education. And it's a consequence of being able to go to world-class schools, universities, that I was able to succeed.